Hey guys! Today I'll be giving a crash course in digital illustration, specifically how to make line art illustrations. This style most closely resembles pencil or fine liner illustrations, so for me, having come from a background of pencil sketching and marker art, I gravitated towards this style when learning digital art and stuck with it ever since. I've been creating digital art for almost 5 years, and nowadays I spend anywhere from 5 to 15 hours a week practicing and creating. I've used several different programs over the last couple years, but for this tutorial, I'll be using my preferred program, Clip Studio Paint Pro. This video will be separated into these sections. Timestamps are in the description if you're looking for help on a specific part of the digital illustration process. And with that, let's get into the tutorial. To start, you're going to need a tablet. This does not need to be big, new, or expensive. My biggest words of advice for a first-time tablet buyer is to avoid buying a tablet with a screen. Not only are they extremely expensive, but you can produce the same quality of art with a cheap screenless tablet. Of course, there's going to be a little disconnect at first when learning to draw without looking at your hand, but you'll find that you'll adjust to this process really quickly. Within 15 minutes of using my tablet for the first time, I felt comfortable drawing with it. Next tablet tip, while your tablet may function without downloading a driver, be sure to install a driver anyway. Without it, important functions of your tablet, such as mapping, pen pressure, and express keys will not work. This leads to my last tablet tip, do program your express keys. These are the buttons not only on your tablet, but on your stylus as well. Assigning your most frequently used drawing software shortcuts to your express keys will make your workflow much more efficient. This is my personal express key setup, and note, because I'm right-handed, the most important shortcuts for me are on the left, where my free hand can navigate them while drawing. After opening your drawing program of choice, you'll be presented with a dialog box that'll ask you for some specifics about your project file. Don't let the amount of information scare you though. Not only can you change these later, but there's only 3 boxes that you need to worry about, and those are the resolution of your image along with the width and height of your canvas. Resolution can be expressed in one of 2 ways. You'll either see it as PPI, short for pixels per inch, or DPI, dots per inch. Both units describe the same concept though. How many pixels squared will fit in an inch of your image? I typically set my resolution to 300 dpi. This is default printing resolution, so anything lower than 300 will look blurry when printed at full size. However, if you're low on space or have no intention on printing your drawing, you can set your resolution to 72 dpi. This is typical screen resolution. I typically work in sizes close to my sketchbooks. Smaller images for me are around 5 by 5 inches, while larger ones are 12 by 12 inches. Keep in mind what you'll be using your image for though. A website graphic is going to be a lot smaller than a poster you'd hang on the wall. I found when learning to create art in a new medium or style, my subject is something I love or am passionate about. This keeps me invested in my work even if the learning process is discouraging. I drew this character when I first learned digital art, so I'll be drawing her in this tutorial. First, you're going to want to select a new layer to work on. Be sure not to draw directly on your background, otherwise your image will become transparent when you erase it. Next, select your brush tool. While there is hundreds of brushes to choose from, a circular one will work just fine. I do lower the opacity of my sketching brush though. This will make the lines you refined and perfect darker while leaving your construction lines faint. I also choose a color other than gray or black to sketch with. It's just a personal preference, but it does help me to tell the sketch apart from my black line art later on. The eraser settings I use are pretty simple too. I keep my eraser at the same size and shape as my sketching brush, but I keep it at full opacity. You'll notice that I flip the canvas as I sketch. This is to check for errors as I draw. Your brain tends to grow numb after looking at your drawing for a while. Flipping your canvas horizontally on occasion is a great way to look at your sketch with fresh eyes and see the errors. Transforming refers to resizing, rotating, skewing, or warping your image. Throughout the sketching process, I'll select portions of my drawing with the lasso tool and transform them as I see fit instead of redrawing. This saves me a lot of time, and I heavily recommend doing this. However, you have to be careful though. You can easily ruin the quality of your artwork by doing destructive transformations. The most common destructive transformation is shrinking an image and then making it larger later. When shrinking an image, you will lose a lot of data, and this will lead to a blurry image when you expand it later. After you're happy with your sketch, you're going to move on to the line art. Before that though, I lower the opacity of my sketch layer. Not only does this make your line art easier to see, it also keeps you from accidentally drawing your line art on your sketch layer. You'll notice the change in your line art opacity right away. You're going to make a new layer, label it line art, or LA is what I typically name mine. Always name your layers. This will save you time and a lot of headache when making more complicated illustrations. I changed my brush just a wee bit for drawing line art. Same circular brush that I sketched with, however, I turn it back to full opacity and shrink the size a little bit and make it black to start. In most drawing programs, it's easy to change the color of your line art. I'll go over how to do that later in this video. One of the most difficult skills to master in digital art is drawing smooth lines. I struggled with this a lot, and I often opted to make my line art in vector programs like Adobe Illustrator because it could make the smooth lines for me. But we are not drawing in a vector program, and this skill is invaluable, so I'm going to give you some tips to make your rastered line art life a little less painful. In most drawing programs, there are brush options that subtly correct your lines as you draw them. This is called stabilization or smoothing. It'll reduce the shakiness of your lines and smooth the overall stroke. Sometimes though, you'll run into a long line that you just can't get right. In these circumstances, I just use my program's curvature tool and save myself some time. This tool is great for long, subtly bent lines. However, with more complex, shorter lines, it's easier to just use the brush tool. After your line art is as you like it, it's on to coloring. We are first going to make a clipping mask. Clipping masks keep you from coloring outside of a specified area. In our case, we don't want to color outside of our line art. What I see a lot of beginners do is they take their wand tool, select all the space inside of their line art, fill those selections, and use that as their clipping mask. This can take a long time, and this process will leave you with little white gaps around the edges of your line art, and we don't want that. Instead, I select the outside of my drawing, invert the selection, fill, and use that as my clipping mask. No more white spaces, and it saves a lot of time. Now once we have our filled shape, we don't want to color directly on it. We'll make a new layer, label it color, and clip it down to the one below. Now whatever we draw on this layer will stay within the restrictions of the clipping mask below. When coloring, you can take your brush tool and color away. A lot of people do this. I save time though by just selecting the areas I want to color. We'll use the wand tool and select the desired areas, but before I fill them, I expand the selection just a little to get rid of those gaps around the line art that I mentioned earlier. Now while you have the whole color wheel at your fingertips, it's important not to go overboard. So many beginners choose to use oversaturated colors in their digital art, and it can make their work unappealing to look at, even if the drawing itself is good. I'd advise against using colors that fall in this area of the color field for filling large portions of your illustration. Just be mindful while coloring and you'll be fine. Coloring is all done, on to shading. We'll make a new layer above the color layer but below the line art layer. Be sure to label it and clip it down to the layer below. Now for my shading layer, I set the blend mode to multiply. What the multiply blend mode does is it makes the layer translucent, and whatever color you use in this layer will make the color below darker and tinted with whatever hue you choose. Using white on a multiply layer will not darken the color below at all, while using black will darken the color below completely. When choosing what color to shade with, the color black might come to mind. In my experience though, shading with black makes the illustration look really dull, and it doesn't take into consideration the color of the light source. Say we're shading a character that's standing outside. Because the color of the sunlight is warm, shadows casted by the sun are typically cool in color. This is why I choose to shade with blue in most situations. The one major exception I make though is when I'm shading skin. The blue shadows, in my opinion, makes human characters appear kinda sickly, so I usually shade skin with pink or a reddish brown. Once you have your color chosen, you're just gonna fill where your shadows are. I block out the general shapes of my shadows first and don't worry about refining them. I end up blending out the rough edges for a soft transition from my mid-tone to shadow. Sometimes though, if I'm doing less detailed work, I refine those blocked out edges and opt for a more cel-shaded style of illustration. However you choose to shade is up to you. After my shading is done, I'll make a new multiply layer above my shadow layer, clip it down, and add a very soft gradient to the drawing. This is totally optional, but I like the subtle variation in color it adds to my drawing. If your drawing is more simplistic or cartoonish in style, you can often skip adding highlights. But I personally think highlights are just as important as the shadows, so I always add them to my illustrations. To do so, we're going to add another layer above our shading layers but below the line art layer. clip it down, and set the layer's blend mode to divide. What the divide blend mode does is it makes the layer translucent and brightens the color below. While using white on a divide layer, this will not brighten the color below at all, while using black will brighten the color completely. It gets a little tricky to use color in this blend mode though. We mentioned how when using color in multiply blend modes, the overall hue is shifted towards the color of the multiply layer. Multiplying with blue will not only darken the color, but will also make it more blue. With divide, the hue chosen is removed from the color below. If you divide with blue, it'll brighten the color and make it less blue. The opposite, or complementary color, to blue is orange, so your highlights will appear orange tinted. So when choosing a color to highlight with, be sure to select the complementary color of the hue you want your highlights to appear as. Because of the color complexity of highlighting and because the color of the highlight is a little less noticeable than the hue of the shadow, I opt to just have white highlights. Don't let the complexity of colored highlights scare you though. In the right situations, colored light can really make your illustrations pop. I block out where I want to add my highlights similarly to how I laid down my shadows. After that, I blend them out. Optional little highlighting detail, I like to add little rim lights to my illustrations. These are thin, bright highlights that exist on the edges of forms where light is being shined from behind a figure, or it's reflected light on the edges of the figure's shadows. And with that, my drawing is just about done. I have two last finishing touches to do. First, I like my line art to be a little less stark in my final composition. I make a layer above my line art and clip it to the line art below as a mask. I take the most prominent color in my illustration, in this case a bluish green, and I select a desaturated version of this color that is also darker than the darkest shadow in my illustration. I just take the fill bucket and fill the layer with the color I chose. This is how you recolor your line art. Last thing to do is sign your piece, of course. I always add the date to the top of my signature too. Now, if you are proud of your work, as you should be, what you made is absolutely amazing, you'll want to export it or save it as a non-project file so you can upload, print, or otherwise share it with the world. The three most popular image file types are JPEGs, PDFs, and PNGs. My favorite to use is PNG, and let me tell you why. JPEGs are a lossy file type, meaning that you'll lose data such as color or detail when exporting as this file type. PDFs are better than JPEGs because they are lossless, meaning you will not lose any data saving as this file type, but they are still second to PNGs. Not only are PNGs lossless like PDFs, they can also have a transparent background unlike either of the two other file types. Here we have my finished drawing, and I hope some of my tips will help you out in your digital art journey. Thank you so much for watching, and if you're interested, here are some time lapses of art I featured in this video. I hope you all have a great day, and bye-bye!